So thank you one more time for joining us today. And we will start today's session with a video greeting from the UN Under Secretary General, Guy Ryder, who is in charge of, among other things, the implementation of the Pact for the Future and the UN 80 reform process.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you for inviting me to join your important conversation. You gather at a moment of profound strain on the international system. Across our world, conflict is deepening, humanitarian needs are surging, and trust between nations is eroding. And today, nowhere is this danger more stark than in the Iranian conflict, with its potential for tragic consequences far beyond the region. The Secretary-General has condemned the military escalation, and he has noted that the use of force by both sides undermines international peace and security. And at the same time, the very institutions created to prevent catastrophe are themselves under pressure. The United Nations faces a severe liquidity crisis driven by delayed and by unpaid contributions, and this is constraining our capacity to deliver. And beyond financial pressures, we're seeing something which I think is even more troubling: a growing willingness to sidestep multilateralism altogether. Competing initiatives, geopolitical fragmentation, and unilateral action all point towards a dangerous alternative: a world governed not by rules, but by raw power. Now, some say multilateralism is failing when it is, in fact, being actively undermined. The erosion of multilateralism is a direct threat to peace, because without a shared system, we do not get a more stable world. We get a more volatile one. A world where the strongest prevail and the most vulnerable get left behind. And this is why the Secretary-General is determined to reform the United Nations, to strengthen it, to address today's challenges, and to prove that multilateralism can work in practice. In 2024, Member States adopted the Pact for the Future, one of the most comprehensive international agreements in decades. At its core, the Pact recognizes that the world has changed and that our institutions must change with it. And on peace and security, the Pact makes several critical advances. Yes, it recommits Member States to peaceful dispute resolution and to strengthening collective security mechanisms. And it also includes the most significant commitments in decades towards reforming the Security Council. It calls for renewed progress on nuclear disarmament, and it recognizes that the nature of conflict itself is evolving, whether through cyber threats, emerging technologies, or the weaponization of space. And it commits to strengthening international frameworks to prevent new domains of confrontation. Importantly, the Pact also mandates a comprehensive review of UN peace operations, so that peacekeeping and political missions can become more agile, more tailored, and more effective in responding to today's complex conflicts. Now, this review will be ready and shared in the coming weeks. We are acutely aware that a pact on paper does not change the world. Implementation does. And implementation is progressing across all of the actions agreed in the Pact. And if the Pact represents what we are trying to do, future-proof the UN 80 initiative represents the how. UN 80, which was launched by the Secretary-General 1 year ago, is an effort to ensure that the UN is not only principled, but capable as well. Today's challenge is not only what the UN does, but how it does it. And the UN 80 is about building a system that is simpler, more coherent, and more effective across its three pillars. It seeks to reduce fragmentation, eliminate duplication, and align mandates with resources so that the UN can deliver real impact on the ground. It's also about strengthening accountability, improving coordination, and leveraging data and technology to make the organization fit for today's challenges. For the people we serve, what matters is not institutional architecture, it's whether the UN delivers. And UN80 is therefore about ensuring that even in a time of constrained resources, the United Nations remains capable, credible, and effective. And your role as civil society actors is absolutely critical in this effort. The United Nations belongs to its member states, but ultimately to the peoples of the world. Time and again, progress at the United Nations has been driven not only by governments, but by the persistent and principled advocacy of civil society. And the Pact for the Future itself recognises the need for stronger engagement with civil society and broader stakeholders. We need your pressure, we need your partnership, and we need participation that is meaningful, sustained, and global. For decades, the International Peace Bureau has been at the forefront of the global peace movement, connecting activists, amplifying marginalized voices, and holding governments accountable on disarmament and on peace commitments. So at a time when multilateralism is under strain, it's easy to be discouraged. But it's more important to remember that the United Nations was not created in a moment of confidence. It was created in a moment of crisis. It was born, as we all know, from the ashes of war, from a determination that humanity could and would do better, and that it must. That responsibility now rests with us. To defend the principles of the Charter, to reform the institutions that carry them forward, and to ensure that multilateralism does not merely survive, but delivers. Civil society has a decisive role to play in this effort, to hold us accountable and to push us further. That's why your conversation is so important and why we look forward to continuing our cooperation. Thank you and good luck.
Many thanks to the Undersecretary General for his remarks there. I think it sets the tone for our conversation today. However, I would like to go a little bit further in some remarks of my own here before we turn to our speakers. By now, many of us are familiar with the Antonio Gramsci quote, but it bears repeating once again. The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. It should be noted that the old world described here was far from flawless in terms of a world order, but rather a product of its time. The colonial victors at the end of the Second World War were not creating a balanced and just international order, but rather solidifying their power and their stance. Still, they did recognize the need for something beyond the anarchy of states that could prevent atrocities and destruction experienced in the First and Second World Wars from being repeated. Unfortunately, it seems many of today's world leaders no longer recognize the need for structures beyond the states, or at very least, they have sidelined international institutions in pursuit of their own national goals. If the United Nations, as written into the very first paragraph of the Charter's preamble, is meant to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, it leaves a lot to be desired. The explosion and expansion of war, armed conflict, and genocide in recent years, from Ukraine to Gaza, Sudan to Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so much further, it paints a dismal and cynical picture of where we're going. Deadlock among the Permanent Security Council members and their use of the veto, blackmail, and threats at members of the General Assembly, and funding shortages have become the default state of the UN. The UN has warned this year of imminent financial collapse due to funding shortages. The US has blocked citizens of certain countries from traveling to the UN office in New York. Violations of international law are met with impunity. Disarmament treaties and trust-building measures are abandoned. The list could go on. While it is clear that the UN in its current state does not function the way it needs to, the alternatives, a new world, so to speak, is still being contested. US President Donald Trump has launched his own UN rival with the Board of Peace, and though the extent to which this comparison to the UN can be argued, what is clear is that for a government to bypass the UN and take action in its own interest, this is what the Board of Peace seeks to do. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also stressed earlier this month that Europe can no longer be a custodian for the old world order, for a world that has gone and will not return. However, for all the talk of the UN and global governance collapse, there are plenty who are doing the incredibly important work of imagining a more effective, inclusive, and just new world. In 2024, the United Nations held the Summit of the Future with the goal of repairing global cooperation and trust through the replacement of outdated structures that no longer reflect today's political and economic realities. Realities in which the balance of power has shifted away from the past 80 years of Western and Eurocentric power to a much more widely distributed one. The resulting document, the Pact for the Future, which was unanimously adopted by all member states of the UN, proposes action on broad themes of peace and security, sustainable development, climate change, digital cooperation, human rights, gender, youth, and future generations. But perhaps most importantly, it also includes the transformation of global governance. At the same time, the commitments in the Pact are worded weakly, lack time-bound commitments, and do not express the urgency so badly needed in these critical moments. The UN has also announced its internal UN 80 initiative aimed at reducing bureaucracy and improving structural efficiency, though it should be noted that the larger systemic issues facing the UN, as the Undersecretary General pointed out, is the responsibility of the member states of the UN. In our engagement at the Summit of the Future and in subsequent meetings with UN officials, what is quite clear is that the work of identifying the future of global governance cannot and must not land on the United Nations or its member states alone. To do so in these moments of geopolitical upheaval, war, militarism, and rearmament would be allowing the monsters to decide the future and indeed endanger our entire planet. Global governance, like so much else these days, relies on the active involvement and leadership of civil society, in generating proposals, in spreading that knowledge to key sectors, and in rallying and pressuring our governments to commit themselves to changes for a more just and inclusive international order. Today, we are privileged to hear from some of these leading initiatives for the reform of global governance. First, we will turn to Guilain Leray, Alfonso Sarni, and Farah Zakir of the New Foundation Working Group, who have focused on transforming the UN into a more equitable and responsive global institution through 13 critical proposals. Then we turn to Sofia Garcia of the Article 109 Coalition, formed by 24 civil society organizations in Nairobi at the Civil Society Conference in support of the Summit of the Future, now consisting of more than 40 organizations, which envisions a general conference to review and update the UN Charter based in Article 109 of the UN Charter. Then we turn to Zachary Peiken of the Better Order Project, a project of the Quincy Institute, which has published a proposed package of global governance reforms following consultations with more than 130 leading scholars, experts, and former officials from more than 40 countries. And finally, we have Professor Anuradha Chinoy, who will focus her presentation on the role of the Global South and the need for greater representation in the UN. Very excited to hear this all and then have comments and feedback from the others. So first, please, Guilain, Farah, Alfonso, the floor is to you.
Thank you. Maybe if Michelle can share the presentation. Thank you. Guilain, we cannot hear you. Maybe you should unmute. Guilain?
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to present you with Farah and Alfonso Zardi rapidly the New Foundation project, the origin. So the New Foundation project was born when I was the main representative of Pact International in UNESCO, with my contact with Chrétiens de la Méditerranée on the Mouvement de la Paix from Alain Rouy. We began the project, and we are now 15 a network of 15 associations or NGOs and we are present in Europe Council in Geneva, UN Geneva. We've worked with IPB on the Article 109 coalition. We think that there is a risk of collapse of multilateralism on the UN. So we belong to civil society, where we are the voice of civil society, and we want to promote a proposal to reform and to reform the international institution. So I will let the floor to Farah Sachs, a PhD, to present our proposal.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Thank you so much, Guylain, for presenting our group. So it was born, as Guylain said, from an initiative which aims maybe to reform the United Nations system, but also go beyond the only United Nations and promote peace through institutions. So, okay, here you can see some of our partners and group members. And so Guylain introduced the floor to me so that I can explain some of the main proposals that we would like to implement. And we tried to think about a chronological order for the potential implementation of these proposals, because we are very aware that we cannot make change, like change takes steps and takes time.
Yes.
So we cannot make change directly. And some proposals might be easier to implement. So we will start by presenting the short-term proposals and then go into the deeper, harder, more politically tricky proposals to implement. So starting with the short-term proposals, which we thought about with our group. First one would be enhancing the status of NGOs and sustaining global forums, such as Sean mentioned earlier, the Nairobi conference of 2024, but also liaison committees like the one in UNESCO between UNESCO and NGOs. And we can also think of liaison committees inside ECOSOC. So the first proposal would be, yes, to enhance the role of NGOs to make the civil society's voice more heard on the international level. And as Sean explained, and as we heard in the Secretary General's presentation, Under Secretary General, sorry, the civil society's role is more critical than ever. So this is maybe one of the good first steps we can take and one of the most easy to implement. Second, we can maybe start and enforce transparency standards for international organizations and NGOs, because we know that some NGOs, some international organizations are funded by maybe states that are part in conflicts or that do not comply with human rights standards. So financial transparency would help make the civil society's voice more trustworthy. So this would be our second step. And of course, there are some international regulations for financial transparency, and we would like to push forward these international standards. Third, maybe supporting representative democracy across the world. And one of the means to do this would be to promote the Interparliamentary Union, which is actually an organization which brings together parliamentarians from around the world and which sieges in Geneva. And one of our proposals would be to support these parliamentarians and maybe to achieve a better exchange between the national scale and the international scale. Fourth proposal would be to promote the concept of human security, which was first brought by the UNDP 1994 program. And the human security actually goes beyond the peace, it actually promotes binding global standards for social and environmental issues. And this could be done on the short term because it would require mobilizing already existing institutions such as ECOSOC, ILO, World Trade Organization, and UNEP, and would not require any new institutional architecture, which is also the case of all the other proposals that I just presented to you. So again, these are short-term proposals which can be put in place and implemented on the short term because they do not require charter reform. They only require to implement and to enforce standards which already exist. And therefore, we are hopeful that these first generation proposals might be put in place in the next few years with civil society's effort and a global effort. So maybe now we can go to some other proposals which would be feasible in the medium term, but which are a little more politically complex to implement. This is why we put them in the second generation. Okay, so first we can maybe try to prioritize arm embargoes against aggressor states rather than economic sanctions, which we know they are they might be may have an effect, a negative effect on civil society, on civil populations. So this is something that is already done on the international scale. So it did happen that the sanctions taken by the Security Council actually put some arm embargoes towards some aggressing states, but we would like to make this a more frequent measure and to make it a rule. So yes, this would be our next proposal. And then, okay, we would also like to strengthen the roles of the UN Secretary General and the General Assembly. And this also might be easier to put in place than other reforms because it does not require a charter reform. It can be implemented through the Uniting for Peace initiative, which we as a group, as the New Foundation Group, actually wrote an article about. So the Uniting for Peace already exists. It allows the General Assembly to act in place of the Security Council in case of a blockage inside the Security Council. So this would be one of our other proposals, but it is also politically complex to implement. Well, the things didn't appear in the right order, but we can also talk about the strengthening of the use of UN peacekeepers and prioritize diplomatic dispute resolution rather than aggressive dispute resolutions, if I can call it that way, which also requires the goodwill of the member states. And also, proposal number 7, establishing a permanent global institution for the environment and climate, which is a little more tricky because it requires the creation from zero of a new international organization. So this would be a little harder, but we can say we think that it is a short-term possibility because there is a global effort to protect the environment and enforce climate and environmental rules. And now for the last generation, so the long-term proposals, third generation. Here, these proposals are a little harder to put in place because they require a reform of the UN Charter. But of course, we think that it would still be possible on the long term. It might be the next slide. Okay. So first, we think that it is important because of the dysfunction of the current UN system to give a higher voice to the global South countries. So this would be possible through reform of the permanent membership composition of the Security Council. And there are some initiatives that have been starting. We can think of, for example, of an initiative by the French and the Mexican governments, which do want to help the Global South acquire some more permanent sieges in the Security Council. But of course, this would be a little harder to put in place because of the veto of the current permanent members. But on the long term, also, we are hoping to suspend the veto right of permanent Security Council members, especially in situations of mass atrocities or acts of aggression in which these permanent members might be responsible. So this would be a long-term proposal, but in the current political context, it might not be as easy to put in place, unfortunately. But we are hopeful. We are hopeful, and we think that step by step, this might be possible to happen someday. Okay, I will be very happy to hear any questions, and Guillaume also, and Alfonso maybe might be able to add some things to what we just said.
Yes, if Alfonso want to take the floor to complete.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor. A few words of presentation. My name is Alfonso Zardi. I'm a former staff member of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, where I still live. And I am also a member of Pax Christi. I do represent Pax Christi International to the Council of Europe, where there is a body which is called the Conference of International NGOs, which is maybe the equivalent of ECOSOC, where approximately 300 international non-governmental organizations covering the whole spectrum of interests and activities, provided they are linked to the values of the Council of Europe, seat are represented and are active. And my experience, and I think the experience shared by all those who sit in this body, is that the voice of the civil society, which is channeled through the conference and goes to the Parliamentary Assembly, to the Committee of Ministers, and to member states as well, is really important. It has taken strength over the years, and now this, let's say, assembly of civil society across Europe is heard and is taken into consideration. And we believe that this is an example that can and is being followed at the level of the United Nations, where the voice of civil societies through several instruments and bodies is put to the floor. It could be put to the fore better or in stronger terms, depending on the association and bodies. A reference was made to UNESCO a moment ago, where Ghislain initiated this process within the non-governmental organizations having a representative body or sitting at the General Conference. This is possibly a good example to be followed with other NGO, with other agency of the United Nations and the United Nations itself. But it is also one of, was the main pillars of our reflection and the proposal that we are putting forward for reforming the United Nations. So the civil society pillar. The second element I would highlight in the framework of our proposals is the role of parliaments, national parliaments. Here, the interlocutor, which has been identified, is the Interparliamentary Union, which is a world assembly of representatives of all parliaments across the world. It has no particular purpose except then defending and promoting the role of parliaments as the voices of citizens in their states, as the channels through which the will, desire, expectations, and decision of citizens are channeled into a form of government. We also have an experience here in Europe, which is both the experience of the Council of Europe and especially of the European Union. It is the Council of Europe which started the experience of having a parliamentary body within an international organization, which is basically an organization of states, like the United Nations. They do not have a parliamentary assembly, actually, and the Parliamentary Union only mildly performs this task, very mildly. But in the Council of Europe first, 1949, and then in the first coal and steel community of Europe in 52, which has then evolved into the European Parliament, we do have parliamentary bodies channeling the voice of citizens. Of course,
sorry, Alfonso, we are at the limit for the time for the first round of presentations.
Okay,
if you could,
I will come quickly to the conclusion. My point is that the voice of parliaments should be heard and become more effective as regards also reforming international institutions, and this is the second point of our one of the points of our proposal. The third element is that the European Union should take the initiative. This was recalled not so long ago by the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Mrs. Baerbock, before the European Parliament here in Strasbourg. And I think that we should hear her voice and follow her strong advice and encouragement to the Parliament and to the Member States of the Union to take the initiative to protect this instrument of international cooperation. And this is fully in line with the values and principles of the European Union. I will only stress the existence of Article 21, letter C of the Treaty of Lisbon, which clearly places the European Union in the trail of the United Nations as an institution that promotes, protects peace, and establishes peace around the world. So the role of the Union is to promote peace. This is exactly the same goal as United Nations and protect it. So there is clearly a complementarity of views and encouragement for the European Union to take this role on behalf of the rest of the world, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfonso. Just one word of session. I wanted to precise that now new foundation project is hosted by Pact France. So great for them. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you for the very interesting presentation. I hope we will have time in the Q&A, perhaps to go more into depth with everything that you were saying. For now, we turn to our next speaker, and I have to apologize because I know that she will have to leave us in just about 20 minutes here, so she will not be at the Q&A, but of course, we hope there will be some more follow-up afterwards. This is Sofia Garcia from the Article 109 Coalition. The floor is to you, Sofia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, Sean, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Sean said, I am Sofia Garcia of Article 109, and I'm actually speaking to you from France, where I think other colleagues are based because I'm at a trip. I'm sorry if the connection is not very good. I've been trying to do my best. That's why I'm connected from my phone. Please let me know if you don't hear me well, and we'll try to rearrange it. It's been a fascinating conversation so far, and I think my presentation and the piece of what Article 109 is doing fits quite well at this point of the conversation. It is clear from what very openly USG Ryder just recognized that the system needs rethinking. And I think we all agree that we need to revamp it, to renew it, to revitalize it, to bring it back to the center of the international arena. Everybody has said the UN is imperfect, it doesn't work very well, but it is absolutely needed. The system, and more importantly, the principles that it represents as the embodiment of the multilateralism, to make it relevant again, because the alternative is not better for humanity. So what we do in Article 109 is to promote one of the channels in which this conversation, this redesign the new multilateral system, or channeling the conversation towards the new multilateral paradigm could happen. And that is Article 109 of the UN Charter. Let me take 2 minutes to do a bit of history and thinking, because I think it's quite relevant. And and I will not be very long because I know you're also late on time, Sean, but when the UN Charter was being drafted and was adopted in San Francisco, there was heated debate of around the veto. Should the veto be included or not? A vast majority of member states, including some that today hold the veto, opposed to the idea. There was one member state that really wanted the veto to be in there and said, this is a prerequisite. The formula that they found to solve this was to include an article, Article 109, that asked the organization to review its practices and to review the charter, review how it operates in the 10th session, in the case of Article 109, in the 10th session of the General Assembly. Let's see how this is working. Let's see where we are. The 1945 context was quite specific, right? And then we can see if we can keep advancing, the institution through its charter to achieve its principles, its core purpose of guaranteeing peace and preventing conflict. So 109 offers a path to rethink what is working, to review, is the word that appears in the charter, what is working and what is not working, and offers as well the path to make those changes in a structure, inclusive, and within the system, right? There is many ways to rethink the global governance paradigm, but the reason why we think 109 is the way is, one, because the conversation would then be held by all member states. Right now, there is conversations around what do we do with the multilateral system in the G7, in Davos, and in the Board of Peace, and in different fora, but none of them is a truly multilateral fora where there is one state, one vote. That is only the UN, right? So we think doing this through a process established by the Charter for the Charter guarantees that it is truly an inclusive conversation. It will also be a structured conversation. How do we have this conversation is mandated. 2/3 of the General Assembly can call for a review. This has to be supported by 9 members of the Security Council, which means the veto power does not apply. No P5 member can stop the conference from happening, the review process from happening. And so it offers a mechanism where we don't have to figure out how do we host this conversation. And it keeps the conversation within the UN because it's a mandate of the UN Charter. I very much liked the previous conversation or the previous presentation, on the levels and when do we act, when do we make it happen, what are short gains and what are long-term gains. We are, or deeper or more focused or more structural changes. Article 109, of course, is focused on the bigger picture side of it. It is not either or, and I don't even think it should be on stages. It can be parallel process, right? Getting the international community to agree that reviewing the charter is necessary, and especially on how the charter should be reviewed, is a process that takes time. So we are focusing on that. I wouldn't call it long term because I don't know if we have a lot of time left to rethink the thing before it kicks in, but in the medium term, do those bigger changes. And in the meantime, it's fantastic that other organizations are taking care of the smaller or more focused changes. I think one of the reasons also why we think that full review of the UN Charter is important is because sometimes there is this phenomenon that we build with one hand, we are unbuilding with the other, right? We have UNGA revitalization, we have the IGN for the Security Council, and we have so many reform processes of the IFIs and so on. And while all those are important, and again, would be absolutely substantial and impactful gains, first of all, small member states that don't have so much capacity cannot be on all of the processes at the same time. So they get kind of left behind. And second, because sometimes, again, what we win in one area, we are undoing in another area by the nature of the negotiation. A negotiation of the whole would make sure that there is gains across, and it would really change the dynamics of how member states come to the negotiating table when several are at the table. And certain processes that have been built for decades, reform processes, may get new oxygen and new air if it is done this way. I think it should be definitely an inclusive process, and that takes time. The charter starts with we the people, and so there should be peoples of the United Nations, and we are also investing a lot in making that happen. We work with Pax Christi, and I have to do a correction here. It is not 40 organizations. We are now 97 members in the coalition. The website is not yet updated, so that may be why there is a bit of confusion, but it's 97 members, and we think it should be really a consultative process. I should say the coalition, the secretariat of the coalition is content agnostic, meaning we don't have concrete proposals of how Chapter 7 should look like or Chapter 6 should look like, but we collect all the proposals that are out there, including the one that was just presented and many other projects from other members. There is a myriad of ideas on how climate change, which is an issue that by nature should be governed globally, or AI should be reflected in the charter to ensure that this global problem is treated at the global level and through the multilateral system. And so what we do is to foster this knowledge, to gather this knowledge, and to present member states with the different options, so that it is an informed negotiation process outside and designed outside the limited, powerful but limited diplomatic circles. I am very happy to answer any questions around what is the appetite that we are finding within member states, ideas on how we can collaborate. We have a way we have a process on the website to join the coalition, and I will have to leave. I can stay 15 more minutes, 20 more. But if there is any questions, please pass them along. Please contact me anytime. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And yeah, please excuse, I did get the number from the website, so I'm very happy to learn that now there are 90 plus members and growing all the time. So we hope also some of the people who are with us today will check out the website, check out the process to join into the coalition and support this amazing initiative. It should be worth noting our next speaker also is from an organization that is part of the Article 109 coalition. This is Zachary Peiken of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and specifically the Better Order Project. Zach, the word is over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean, for the invitation. Really delighted to be here today with all of you amongst friends. As Sean just said, I'm Deputy Director of the Better Order Project at the Quincy Institute. He talked a little bit about the nature of the project and the types of people it brought together a little bit earlier on in the webinar. Let me just provide a little bit of a background on sort of the concept, the thinking behind, how we started this project in the first place. And the core sort of assumption that we had is that the world is becoming less unipolar. And that sort of set us apart from many other think tanks in the United States, where the assumption guiding many of the reports that they put together is, how can we renew American leadership for the 21st century in the world? And our assumption is that there's an important role for the United States to play, obviously, but that the world is becoming less unipolar, that unipolarity is not sustainable. And, scholars have quibbled about, the extent to which the emerging world is multipolar or bipolar, because the United States and China are more or less peers in many respects, but there's no other power that is really a peer of theirs, even if they may be poles in certain respects. There are others who are of the view that the world is still largely unipolar, although not as unipolar as it was in the 1990s. Nonetheless, the direction of travel, the trajectory is clear, that the world is, in relative terms at least, becoming less and less unipolar. And that means that other powers are going to have the ability to do to the United States what the United States has had the ability to do to them, to impose pressures, to weaponize interdependence, as it were, to force compromises. And therefore, we're going to need to find ways to share power in the world today and to find ways to stabilize an international order in transition. And that international order, of course, has been subject in recent years to fundamentally different perspectives about what constitutes a legitimate order, different normative perspectives. And so, in order to do that, basically the question is, what are the tools? What are the instruments that we can do in order to stabilize this international order in transition? What are the instruments we can use? And the most readily available instruments just happen to be, the multilateral institutions and tapestry of international law that we have inherited, that needs to be updated, of course, in a world that needs to be basically to account for the realities of the new world. So basically, these institutions need to be rendered fit for purpose for this new world. But Sean talked a lot about this a great deal at the beginning of today's webinar. That the world of 1945, of course, is no longer the world of today. So there's this tension, between the fact that these are the most readily available tools, but that these tools, of course, need to be strengthened. They need to be updated, and you guys are all, of course, very familiar with that. The question is, how do you do that? And so our project focused exclusively on the international security order. And through this long process of reflection that lasted for over a year, we arrived at 7 key variables on international security, where our network of over 130 former experts and statesmen came up with a series of proposals, 20 proposals in total, spread out across these 7 different policy areas, including UN Security Council reform, the norms surrounding the use of force, avoiding nuclear war, economic statecraft and sanctions, climate, peace and security, artificial intelligence, and regional security orders, last but not least. We've been active to greater or lesser extents over the past a year and a half since our report was published, basically pushing some of these different ideas from these 7 different variables. We've been more active in particular on UN Security Council reform. So we've been quite present on the New York circuit on that issue. And that's partly because the proposals we put forward on reforming the Security Council really do try to bridge the gap between the existing political and regional and cross-regional groupings in creative ways that have not necessarily been put forward before. So I'm just going to share my screen with you guys just to get a sense of what we were able to put together in our network on this. And I hope you can all see what I'm seeing right now, this graphic right here, which is a brief summary of our proposal for Security Council reform. As you can see, we propose moving from 15 members to 24. And the way that we would do this is that we suggest that there should be 4 new permanent members added, but that these members should ideally be elected by the General Assembly rather than just deciding in advance who these are going to be in line with the G4 proposal. There could be a special carve-out for Africa, of course, in line with the Pact for the Future's statement that Africa should be treated as a special case. Now, once these 4 new permanent members are elected, and we determine there's really no way around expanding the permanent membership of the council. You need to have a situation where countries like India are going to feel like they have a stake really in the future of multilateralism that's commensurate with their status. But the question then becomes, of course, all these other likely middle powers, what do they think? They're going to feel left out. And this is one of the reasons why you have this group Uniting for Consensus that has always been opposed to expanding the permanent membership of the council. And so what we proposed here is actually something novel here. There are obviously proposals that are already on the table about how to develop longer term seats, set aside a small number of seats for longer term re-electable countries. And what we're proposing instead of that is to have an actual pool. So once the new permanent members are elected over here, you then have an election for this pool of 15 different countries. And so rather than just set aside 4 or 5 seats for longer terms that can be reelected, you have this pool of 15 countries that are elected simultaneously, and 5 out of those 15 countries are serving on the council at a given time for a 4-year term. So it's a longer term than the current term, which is 2 years for non-permanent members. So it gives them the chance to get a little bit used to the functioning of the Security Council, etc. and to make the most of their term there. But you get 15 countries that are taken into this pool rather than just 4 or 5. And that's a huge benefit for the smaller countries as well and among the UN member states, who therefore don't have to compete against these 15, not just 4 or 5, but 15 likely middle powers for a non-permanent seat. So it's a great benefit for both medium-sized countries and smaller-sized countries alike. The medium-sized countries, of course, in our model here, would get 2 automatic 4-year terms by getting elected to this pool. So you get 4 years, and then it's the next 5 countries who get 4 years, then the next 5 countries that get 4 years, and then the first 5 countries go again for another 4 years. So it goes through the cycle twice before this pool of 15 countries is dissolved and then re-elected, and you're capable to be re-elected to that pool after 24 years. So you get a guaranteed 8 years on the council by being elected to this pool. It's an enormous improvement over the status quo where you can only be elected for a 2-year non-renewable term. But of course, it's a huge advantage for these smaller countries as well, who would of course have the opportunity to compete for one of these 15 seats, but even if not, wouldn't have to compete against those middle powers. So the benefit of this model as a whole is that, you're only at 24 total seats. You don't have to expand the non-permanent membership. All the other models that are out there right now are talking about expanding the non-permanent membership. This is a way that you can sort of advantage more countries and advantage all the different regions, regional groupings at the UN, without necessarily going over the top and having 25, 26, 27, etc. countries. You can have a more efficient council and still have a representative council under our model. We're only at 24 total, and that is a smaller number than any other model that has been put forward at the IGN process so far. There's also the question of the veto, what to do, in particular with these 4 new permanent members. And so we just propose a couple of scenarios, basically in which one scenario is in which these 4 countries, choose voluntarily to forego their veto privilege. In which case, we suggest that to level the playing field between them and the existing permanent members, the existing P5 would agree to what we call a 1+1 mechanism, which means that if you are one of those P5 countries and you want to cast a veto, then you have to find another member on the Security Council out of the other 23 countries on the Security Council and under our model, also to vote no. And if you do that, then your veto is safe and cannot be overturned. But in the event that you are completely isolated, and you are, obviously a country that is, in this case, committed an egregious violation of international law, or are defending a country that has committed an egregious violation of international law, protecting that country, then the General Assembly by 2/3 majority could overturn that veto. That's our proposal. So it's only to be used in really the most, extreme circumstances, basically, in which, a veto could actually be overturned. You would think that a great power would be able to find, or to, insist on, one other country on the Security Council also to vote no along with it. So it's a compromise that hopefully, the P5 would be willing to accept in the name of finding a reform for the council, a formula for reform that the 2/3 of member states could get behind, and that would ultimately be in their interest as well, because it would preserve the status of the P5 on the council, which is beneficial obviously to the P5 in the international order. The second scenario we put forward is if these new 4 permanent members want veto privileges and insist on it and will not compromise, in which case we simply propose a 1+2 mechanism rather than a 1+1 mechanism. So you need to find 2 other countries serving on the Security Council also to vote no along with you in order to insulate your veto from possibly being overturned. We have a number of other veto restriction proposals that we put forward as well, such as finding ways to strengthen the Peace Building Commission, as well as creating a 4th voting option even, which would allow permanent members to vote no without necessarily invoking a veto. So that would raise the political costs of invoking a full-blown veto. But please do feel free to consult betterorderproject.org, and we have a number of those proposals in much more detail. Just to let you know how this works out from a regional perspective, which is, as you can see here, our model here, the Better Order Project model on the left, comparing it to all the other complete models that have been put forward at the IGN process so far. For the global majority, our model does better than any other model. So Africa and Asia here, so you've got Asia in red and Africa in gold. Our model does better for both of them than any other model so far. Our model actually leaves Africa and Asia tied as the single largest represented groupings on the Security Council. There's no other model that does that. Here in blue, you've got both the Western European and others group and Eastern Europe together at 28%. So if you take those two regional groupings, put them together, you've got marginally more than Africa and Asia under our grouping, under our model, rather. But not only that, we've got fewer total seats, as I've said, than any other model. We've got 24. All the other models so far have 25, 26, 27, etc. And despite that, our model actually does better for Asia and Africa, not just in relative terms, but quite often in absolute terms than any of these other models that have more seats overall. And in all these places where you see an asterisk, that's a place where our model does better in relative terms and absolute terms compared to these other models that have been put forward so far. Now, Asia and Africa, they're the two biggest groupings at the United Nations. You need their support in order to get any reform over the finish line, and you also need their support in order to build a more inclusive international order that's actually going to be durable and be fit for purpose for the 21st century. So we're happy with how these numbers have turned out. It took a lot of calculations on our part, but we basically got there eventually. And very happy to answer any questions you may have, but maybe for now I'll leave it there just to make sure we've got enough time for questions, because I think we've just got under half an hour left.
Thank you so much, Zach. And yes, unfortunately, we are a little bit behind our schedule as we do still have one more speaker, but I think, we will, insofar as speakers are available, stay on a few extra minutes for questions if needed. Just to say, I was very honored to be able to join at the Summit of the Future presentation Zach gave on this on the work that they've done. And it's really an excellent text, so I can just recommend that everyone look through the websites and all these proposals that they have to offer, which go beyond also what Zach could cover in the 10 minutes here. So now we turn to our final speaker for today's session. This is Anuradha Chinoy, who is an adjunct professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs at the Jindal Global University in India. She's also an honorary associate fellow at the Transnational Institute and part of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. Anu, the word is over to you now, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, and co-panelists. Firstly, I think I welcome the outcome of the UN Summit of the Future and endorse its recommendations. And I also believe that the speakers before me made very significant points, and I think I would agree with the kind of model proposed by the Quincy Institute, and I think what I'm going to say says why. Now, of course, there are three broad paradigms on UN reform. First, from the P5, and that powerful hegemon that seeks to bypass the UN and use the Security Council and veto powers, and the other P5 who have veto powers. And they're quite happy with the status quo and not really committed to reform. The second group are the political West that benefit from that hegemony. And these two groups were the ones who were instrumental in constructing the UN and designed international law to favor themselves. So they see no great urge for reform and are willing to bypass it. Now, the third group comes from the global South and global civil society, and I put them together, the climate activists, the women, the feminists, who were excluded from the construction, decision-making and policy and the history of the UN for decades. And they are the ones who seek reform, and they are the ones who would make the pressure group and seek voice within. Even though they often watch very helplessly as its charter vision goals are violated, often against them. Of course, the center of the UN reform, as everyone has said, is the Security Council. And so that's, I think, where we need to focus. And given this multipolar transition, I think the time is much more appropriate now for pushing for this reform. And I will now just speak on my last 2 points, which is why the global South is an important actor in this reform. Now, the post-colonial global South has been asking to be an actor rather than an object or an instrument for extraction, for war, for interventions. And they have made multiple suggestions, submitted documents, supported resolutions asking for a greater voice in all multilateral institutions, including of course, the United Nations and also the World Bank, etc. And this urging has come right since the Bandung Principles reiterated by the non-aligned movement in a yearly exercise. So they reiterate this every year, and so do the regional organizations of the Global South, like the ASEAN, the African Union, the ECLA, the SCO, and now even the BRICS, who are saying that, yes, there should be UN reforms. And all these, especially from the Global South, they argue for peaceful coexistence, a right to sovereignty, right to choice, etc. within. And they have added to it women in development, environment, climate, sustainability. So they're all issue-based reasons why they're arguing that there needs to be UN reform. Now, at the same time, I am not privileging the politics of all the Global South countries, many of them who are very aligned with the Global North. And though this Global South is a geospatial region, and many are still struggling against all sorts of colonialism, settler colonialism, wars, etc., their own ethnic problems, interwars, etc. Yet, and the other problem is that selective southern states and a large section of southern elites have been successfully globalized and seek merger and engagement with the North. So what I'm talking about is the ontological Global South, where the Global South is an idea which has no boundaries but emancipatory goals, visions, and tactics. This Global South, and also the real, Global South countries, one, they have never been they've not been part of any hegemony. They've not been hegemonic in the world or colonizers, though some large states do have minorities who are at risk. Second, the Global South still argues for decolonization and also for accommodation and sharing, but not erasure of history. So they're not arguing for the kind of decolonization that the word suggests, but the incorporation of the best in all civilizations. So recognition, reasonable reparation, and reconciliation. Third, the Global South has partners, not allies. The Global South is not part of any military alliance, though they are bound with commitments. And they don't have any kind of form that gives them exclusive security, and nor do they have any collective military system. So they are the ones who actually profess common security, global disarmament, human security, food, and all the other things that all of you have listed. Fourth, I think Global South has no command and control center. So it's seen as incapable of any balanced or militarist power equation, because the currency in international power and security is seen as force. But the Global South is actually always using the democratic method because they're so plural in themselves. And they really know how to balance this and come to some conclusion if you actually mine the resolutions of the organizations, their organizations, which I have named. So they are decentered, they are demilitarized overall. Their security is focused on decentering, demilitarization, degrowth, de-indebtedness, decontrol narratives, and a kind of proper autonomous development. So the flip side is when some country is under attack, and if there's a military intervention, the Global South only uses rhetoric. They urge dialogue, negotiation, and step back. So they cannot underwrite the security of either themselves or the region, and therefore they depend on the Global North. So they lack capability and cannot physically match or project power, as they only have moral power. So, the Global South thing is legitimacy, is moral power, normatives, international law, rule of law, etc. But they themselves are usually victims of these norms by those who possess hard power. So this ontology is actually evident in the pattern and behavior that is fundamentally different than the approach taken now, especially now as the UN is being bypassed, but we are still hopeful that this hegemonic politics of extractivism, interventionism, use of visible force and invisible threat, sanctions, etc., would go on to a decline as multiple nodes and multipolarity emerges, but it's a process. So I would really support what you have said about having a democratic movement for reform. So really this convergence, I believe that now, I think the next step should be a tactic of implementing this reform. And in this, I would argue that a convergence of global South states, especially the small states, which did, for example, the model of the TPNW treaty, the Treaty for Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, and how small states gathered and the treaty came into force, along with progressive CSOs and ideas, working with feminists, climates, debt cancellation, peace movements, workers and unions who move on to put pressure on this reform. So it is this idea of the global South as opposed to pure physicality or geospatial terrain that we need to take forward in the UN in collaboration with progressive and committed CSOs and movements. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu. I thought that was really great, and great to also have outlined the potential next steps that we can take. Now, we are lucky enough that Sofia Garcia from the Article 109 Coalition is still with us at the moment, but she will have to leave within the next few minutes here. So I would just like to ask first if we have any questions specifically towards Sofia that anyone would like to ask. If you can use the raise hand function or add your question into the chat. We have been keeping track of those questions already in the chat, and if I don't see other hands, I'll go forward with those questions to start us off at least. And Sophia, then I'll give you the floor first, but I think some of these questions maybe also other people would like to answer. So the questions I see here, I think there are 3 or maybe 4. The first one being, do you believe meaningful reform of the UN Security Council, particularly regarding the veto power, is realistically achievable? Or are there alternative mechanisms needed to address global conflicts? The second question is, what would you say could be the 2 most important external factors needed to be in place to advance reform of the Security Council? The third, this question I think is more directed towards Alfonso and our colleagues from the new foundation, but what is it that we're hoping of the EU? And the fourth, I forget whose presentation this was during. Someone mentioned that, I think it was during the Better Order project, claiming nice idea in Germany. It's discussed as a qualified majority. I think this would lead to more wars that perhaps some people would like to respond to too. Before we do that, I do see we have one hand up coming from Richard Eschon. Please excuse any mispronunciation. If you'd like to ask your question, you're welcome to do so now.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Good afternoon from Ghana. I'm Richard Eschon. I am with Center for Human Security in Africa, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library, and then a fellow with Global Peace Study for Sustainable Development in Africa, St. Augustine's University, Tanzania. With the issue of Global South and Global North, when we watch the activities of United Nations in a pictorial form, as in the videos and the reality, we not get the real concept of who they are or what it is that they do. They sometimes deal with cultures. That's why we have UNESCO and other of them. They deal with cultural ability. Someone may be poor in his or her cultural, cultural norms. It has the same meaning to someone, the same expression to someone with maybe aggressive practices in their cultural norm. At the end of the day, one finds it difficult to understand the other. And then this, misunderstanding sometimes follow. I believe that we get the real meaning that UN will come to, just that enclosed. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you again. There was
Yes.
a bit of a breakup, but you're back.
Oh, then I'm sorry. Enclosed entity. At that particular time that they have a meeting, you realize a different, environmental power that is needed to lead. Maybe that is needed to go forward. That particular time, do we see that power? Shared? But I believe I'm happy that organizations outside the UN itself will discuss shortcomings, shortfalls before before, I don't know how to end it, but I don't know. You let me end it here, and then I'll come again, sir. Please. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. So, Sophia, we will give you the floor first. I know you have to leave in just a minute or two here, so thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I am sorry for the rush, and thank you for the fellow panelists to allow me to come first. I'm going to start with Richard's point. And I understood what you meant, I hope, Richard. One of the reasons why we think charter review is very important, besides the one-on-one focused changes and improvements, is because the UN Charter was built in a completely different geopolitical reality, in a completely different world, and by a handful of people that is not representative of humanity today, or even geopolitics today, right? Only 4 African countries were part of the drafting of the charter. And if you look at the global picture, only barely 1/4 of the membership today was present in the signing of the charter. The system that everybody works on and the system that affects everybody was not designed by everybody. And that is a historical injustice that is especially unfair to those that were not there, which happens to be the back then colonized global South. And that means that you can only address and you can only change if you go to the charter, if you go to the foundational document and allow that the new global paradigm is designed by all actors that are part of it. And it's not only unfair, it's also inefficient because it creates a feeling of detachment. I have talked to some ambassadors and members of governments of maybe small islands and others that say the feeling of ownership that we have of this system is very little because we are just a small fish in a game of powerful ones. And so it's really inefficient in terms of ownership. There is definitely risks of what we can win and what we can lose and what's at stake, when we reform the charter. But the undeniable win is that whatever the output is, it will be designed by everybody, democratic way. So process matters as much as what you get from it, right? And I hope that was where the comment was going into, and connects very well to the previous panelist as well. Very, very quickly, is Security Council reform achievable? Yes, everything is possible. I mean, the drafters of the charter signed the UN Charter on the 26th of June 1945. The Pacific was still active. Hiroshima and Nagasaki after. The environment there was not a pre-possible Third World War. The environment back then was war, right? And so it is definitely possible. It needs much more effort than the one that the UN is doing, that member states is doing, and I would argue civil society is doing. So with push and coordination, it is definitely possible. And that brings me to the last point. What would be the external factors that allow for that council reform or charter reform, right? To redefine the system. So I think there is two ways that motivate people towards change and to be active towards change, to want to get out of the status quo. The first one is fear. The United Nations was not created out of a rainbows and hearts type of environment. It was created because whether they did that or we would all disappear from the face of Earth, and there was all the threat of war. So fear is a factor that would lead to a Security Council reform, to a UN Charter reform, I would say. But I don't think we want to take that path because the fear created by a Third World War would be, and the destruction would be way bigger than the one of the Second World War, right? And the threat to the very existence and cognitive security of humanity has. So assuming we don't want to get to the point where we have so much fear that we get into action, the second way is motivation, is to focus on what we have to win from changing things and not what we have to lose from changing things, right? We are so attached to the status quo of keeping things as they are, maybe small changes, just enough to get the head out of the water. I think we need to do some thinking on how do we think of what we create in the future and not what we want to correct from the past, because that would allow for changes, and now I'm talking about charter reform, not only of the structures that are meant to protect us from the threat of war, as it is the Security Council, but it will also allow us to create the structures need to protect us from different threats to humanity that are not war and didn't exist in 1945. And I'm thinking, just to name an example, climate change, which is a pretty powerful threat to our very existence, or, for example, the global governance of artificial intelligence and the opportunity, but also the threat that can mean for at least the cognitive security of human beings. So my last appeal is, let's try to get into not how to correct it a little bit and how to save it, because the underlying structure is so unfair, but to never waste a good crisis and get into the set of mind, okay, what we had is not there, is not sustainable anymore. Let's now go into building something good and not just small changes. Again, having said from the beginning that both tracks are complementary.
Thank you so much, Sophia. We will quickly turn to Zach because he also will have to leave in just a few minutes here. So Zach, any responses you may have?
Thanks, John. Yeah, let me just very briefly tackle the question about what are the factors that are going to be necessary to be in place for Security Council reform to become a reality. And obviously they are several, but let me just name a couple. One is that I would caution against claiming that the P5 are the biggest obstacle to reform. And I know that this is the constant refrain that people always say is that, oh, well, we can't ratify anything unless the P5 are on board. And so therefore the P5 are never going to agree to this and never going to agree to that. And therefore we're not going to get a reform. If you want to reform the UN Charter, you need two things, not just one thing. Yes, you need the unanimous support of the P5, but you also need 2/3 of all UN member states to be behind a given model. And people tend to, forget about that latter thing. Because the problem is right now there is no formula. There is no model that's been put forward that enjoys 2/3 support among member states on all these other clusters of questions about, do we expand the permanent membership or do we not? And, do new permanent members get the veto or do they not? And everyone has sort of been remaining, unfortunately, by and large, entrenched in their existing positions for decades now. And this has been, hugely damaging, to the multilateral system. So, a whole host of member states are responsible for the failure to create this more inclusive UN architecture. It's not just the P5. I think if you had a significant agreement among a major mass, it doesn't have to be unanimous, but clearly more than 2/3 of all member states uniting behind a serious model and uniting to put pressure on the P5 after that to support that model or some variation of that model, and then negotiations would begin in earnest. I think that would be hugely, powerful for the reason I'm about to say. The second reason, the second factor that needs to be in place, I think it's actually, again, counterintuitively here. I think that the fact that the great powers today are in competition with one another, the fact that they're not getting along necessarily well, that's a factor that makes it counterintuitively perhaps easier to reform the council rather than harder. Right? The received wisdom out there is that, oh, the great powers aren't getting along, therefore the international order is collapsing, therefore it's a crisis of multilateralism, etc. And therefore we could never possibly hope, to reform these multilateral institutions because we couldn't reform them, back in the 1990s and 2000s, when we were living in the end of history. So how on earth could we possibly hope to reform them today? But great power competition actually provides incentives for the different great powers to try to look as if they're the good guy and not the bad guy. And we were hearing, from Ms. Chenoy about the global south. So much of the great power competition of the future is going to be fought, in the global south for approval of the global south and for influence in the global south. And the majority of UN member states are in the global south. So, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure certainly on Russia and China, not to look as if they are the bad guy when it comes to charter reform. In the meantime, of course, they're trying to look as if they're the good guy and they support charter reform in principle, but of course they don't really do anything active to move forward on it because the status quo suits them just fine, or so they think. It might not suit them just fine forever as these institutions become less and less relevant because these institutions still do offer them a very privileged position ultimately in the international order. But as time goes on, and if there is an actual concrete proposal on the table that we can use to put pressure on the P5, then the discussion begins in earnest. And then these great powers are going to actually have to be forced into saying what they do support or what they don't support. And so probably the United States would be the most difficult one of the three, the U.S., Russia, and China, to get on board. Especially because you need U.S. Senate ratification, and that's not that's much easier said than done. But ultimately, if the U.S. is serious about great power competition, which by all measures, by all accounts, it certainly appears to be, then it may also feel incentivized at some point to look as if it's not playing the bad cop all the time. And in fact, there's a window now. We're in an era of great power competition now. That period of great power competition might not last forever. I'm not predicting this, but let's say the U.S. and Russia, manage to, end their dispute over Ukraine, and all of a sudden they're starting to get along a lot better, and they reset their relations. And let's say the U.S. and China also reach some kind of a new grand bargain, which Trump maybe is pursuing at least to some extent. We've got a new bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping that's been set now for mid-May. That could lead to a thaw in great power relations. In which case, it'll go back to the situation that was before, which is the P5 don't agree on everything, but one thing they do agree on is to maintain the status quo at the UN in terms of their own status at the Security Council. So we have every incentive not to want to see those three countries necessarily working together to resist pressures coming from below. Counterintuitively, it actually might be, in the interest of multilateralism to have a little bit of space between the great powers. And in fact, that speaks to the logic of multilateralism more generally, right? You know, the old saying by the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, which is the UN was not created to take the world to heaven, it was created to prevent it from going to hell. Multilateralism is not about living in heaven and living in a utopia. It's about helping to guide us through periods like the one we're living through today, in which there are divergent interests, and indeed there will always be divergent interests. That's how the interstate system works. There are divergent interests among states. The question is, how do you manage those interests? What are the instruments and tools you use? And multilateral institutions are obviously going to be a key part, not the whole part, but a key part of that equation.
Thank you so much, Zach. I am realizing we're at our time now, but I do want to give our other panelists a chance to speak. Anu, the floor is quickly to you. I know you also have to leave here, so thank you for staying on.
Okay, very, very quickly. One, I think, having been part of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, war, and peace, I think reform is possible because we have to take lessons of how globally the women managed to pass that resolution. And I went for several conferences on that, so I know it's possible. Second, I think the way, again, I'm just talking of tactics because I agree largely with what Zachary and the Quincy Institute are saying, is that rather than completely change the charter, because you're going to then upset power blocks, it's better to just expand on it. You expand on the vision statement, you expand on the Security Council. And I'm a great believer in not just saying, one from Asia and one from Africa, but rather, okay, one from Asia, I have one from Africa, Latin America, but democratically elected. So the accountability that we are talking about comes into. So it's very important that if the P5 are going to be expanded as this model suggested, it should be through democratic elections once every 2 years, rather than just by rotation, so there is accountability. And third, again, I stress on the small states because they really don't have any voice, but they have very good ideas and experiences. And if there has to be reform, one has to not just get their support, but a push from that they have a collective will, which I think these organizations that we have here today have the capacity to do. So thank you very much. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thank you for staying on. Now we do have our final three panelists here to respond to the questions, give us some closing remarks. We also have, I think, 2 new questions you can choose to answer that have come into the chat. The first one is coming from Hemachandra Basappa saying, you have all put in a lot of research, study, and discussions into your suggestions, but how do you communicate with the UN member states? The representatives in New York or Geneva are posted for 2 to 4 years. Your ideas have to be discussed regularly with them. Is anyone doing this? And the second question, coming from Syed Nassim Siraj Rudo, is asking, when will the UN stop talking about reform and start implementing a structure where the Global South has actual veto-level decision-making power in global peace governance? So feel free to answer those questions as well as the previously asked questions. I don't know who amongst you would like to go first. Any volunteers? Ilan, you have to unmute, but yes, please go ahead.
Yes, we have with Pacific International. We have representative in New York and in Geneva. So we follow. We hope that they will take in account our proposal and to diffuse with the states. And we rely also upon IPB and Article 109 to be in contact with states. It's the interest to be in link with other NGOs and a group of NGOs, in fact.
Great, thank you, Gilan. Anyone I'd like to add to that? Alfonso?
Thank you. Well, perhaps not exactly expanding on what Ghislain has said, because it's a response to the truth, but responding to a remark concerning my own proposal or my own insistence on the role of parliaments and especially of the European Union. I fully understand, I'm fully aware that this is not from overnight that the European Union may wish to play a very active role in, let's say, UN reform in general. But there are very strong foundations for that, because, as I said, in Article 21, letter H of the Treaty of Lisbon, the Union is committed to protecting and strengthening multilateralism. It is not just taking part in the international affairs, but do take part in international affairs with the view to promoting multilateralism and keep the system going. And this system is strongly under attack. So in a sense, it is an obligation. And I would add that in that sense, the European Parliament has a role to play, because it conveys the will and expectations of the society. And also it reflects a sort of a regional position. The EU is not a regional organization in the meaning of Article 52, I guess, of the UN Charter, but it can play this role. And that's why I think that movements like ours should make bigger efforts to convey the message through the institutions, and in particular through the European Parliament. There is a right of petition. We can submit proposals and petitions many ways, lobbying basically. But I think this is a channel which should not be avoided, because it carries a strong political weight. And the UN as a special non-state observer state, etc., etc. So we are well positioned, and we should use this channel.
Thank you so much, Alfonso. Farah?
Okay, I do not think I can ever answer a question that's just such as the one Syed Nassim asked, but I want to be positive about this. And all of the speakers today were positive, because actually, when the UN, as we are observing it today, and when unilateralism are so ineffective, they have reached a point where they have to reinvent themselves in order to still be credible. So I think that for this reason, which is maybe negative at a first glance, the time for change is now, you know. So this is, I mean, my vision of things. But of course, I think that the only solution would be to still be optimistic, and I really believe in the importance of the civil society's voice to make change happen, because the need comes from the ground, and then can be implemented on a higher scale, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much again. Thank you to all the participants that have stuck around this long. I know we've gone a bit over our time today, but I do like... Yes, Gila.
Yes, just to say that there is a petition on change.org, which is present in Pacific International website, and on CCIC, also in UNESCO, the network of Catholic NGOs in UNESCO. So you can go on from the new foundation proposal.
Thank you, Gina. We've also posted that into the chat, so hopefully everyone has seen it, and I think we will follow up. Someone has asked in the chat for the recording and for the presentation of the new foundation that was shared, so we will also try to put together those resources and send them out to everyone who joined us today. Thank you one more time. Just to reflect what Farah said, the time for change is now, and I just want to emphasize, as many of our speakers did today, of course, we heard a lot of great ideas here, but great ideas themselves are not enough to change the world. It requires all of our efforts as civil society, as peace-loving peoples and justice-loving peoples from around the world, to take action based on what we've heard today, to build off of these ideas, and to make sure that what we envision for the future can become the reality that we live. Thank you all so much. Until the next time, goodbye.